right. Hello, everyone. All right, we are live. Well, welcome to the Admissionado GMAT Club session on what is so special about MBB, or as it is commonly known, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. So my name is Seth Shapiro, and I am a consultant or a senior consultant at Admissionado. We are a premier admissions consulting and counseling firm. We work with both college and MBA students, so we are always happy to take questions and to help you in your pursuit of both college, MBA, and other master's admissions process. So it's great to meet you all. Just by way of structure, what I am going to do is I have some slides prepared that I'm going to share with you in the broader audience, and I will take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat, but also bear in mind that I will catch up later on. So if everyone's okay with that, let's get started. So again, welcome to our session, What's So Special About MBB? So as I mentioned, the MBB is a common vernacular acronym that's used to describe what is considered the big three consulting firms: McKinsey and Company, the Boston Consulting Group, and Bain and Company. So before we even get into that, let's talk about what is management consulting. It's kind of an amorphous term. A lot of people who have been management consultants or aspire to be management consultants are oftentimes coming up with questions to say,
sorry to interrupt, but we don't see the slides advancing. We are still on first slide.
Oh, okay. Hold on one second. Thank you. Sorry for the... How's that?
Yes. Now we see.
Sorry for the technical difficulties, everyone. All right. So are you seeing this now? What is management consulting?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. So a lot of times you'll get a question from someone which is, oh, I'm a consultant, or I want to go into consulting. And a lot of people ask, well, consulting what? Right? And so consulting is a very broad definition, after all, or a very broad industry. Right? After all, consulting means to advise people, right? So you have to get very specific into the space of management consulting. So a management consultant is basically an advisor, right? A highly trained advisor who works with, let's call them leadership teams or management or C-suite executives to assess an organization or a company, and I help them identify problems, gather information, and implement solutions. So, and management consulting, specifically in the context, we're going to talk about it today for McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. They tend to work in sort of what's called case teams. And so they're not actually employed by the client themselves. They are employed as a contractor in a lot of ways, or a consulting firm. So they are sort of a third-party outside advisor who comes in with a specific problem in mind or a specific case. These cases can range in size and scope. So there are many consultants who might work on anything as short as a 2-week engagement, where they might be working for a private equity firm to assess, a particular company or an individual market, or they could be working with a multinational corporation for 6 months, 12 months, up to 2 years. These engagements can be very long. So when you think about the type of work that consultants do, there's a huge gamut. So you should definitely, as you think about these types of options, ask what types of cases you'll be working on and so forth. Management consultants can also be very specialized. So if you were to start at a consulting firm, mostly out of an undergraduate program or an MBA program, you might start off as a generalist, but over time, the expectation is that you will specialize in either an individual sector or a function, or in some cases both, depending on the firm itself. So in terms of sectors, you may be looking at something as healthcare, technology, manufacturing, or education. And then in terms of functions, it could be human resources, it could be information technology, restructuring, cost and price sensitivity. I mean, there is a large range of options. And so most of these big consulting firms, especially MBB, will have focus areas, but they will typically cover a full range of these sorts of industries and sectors. So the world is your oyster. And as I mentioned a few seconds ago, I talked about some of the case examples, but I've just listed a couple here where you might be working on a go-to-market plan for a global aluminum company looking to enter a new geography, or you might help design a cost-cutting strategy for, say, a national athletic sneaker and apparel manufacturer. There are a lot of cases because companies, nonprofits, investment firms have a lot of strategic questions on the table, and they're looking for people who can come in, who are smart, who work quickly, and can help deliver on answers, or at least help develop a strategy to help find out those answers. So, taking even a step back, where did this whole idea of management consulting come from, right? Or where did specifically MBB firms come to the forefront? So, way back when, MBA classrooms were really full of students who came from what we consider to be sort of traditional blue chip companies, or sort of industry as it's known nowadays. So they may have worked at companies like General Electric or AT&T or Bell, Verizon, and and over time, a lot of the questions that these executives or these MBA students would face would actually just sort of be discussed amongst themselves. Everything was sort of, you work with the people who are employed by these firms, right? But over time, management consultants sort of became this idea of, we can hire a policy consultant, right, or an operations research and so forth, right? And so there became this need to have people who had outside expertise in these functional, strategic ways of doing business. And so as consulting sort of became more of a thing, they became more excited. The MBA programs became more excited by having these types of people. And so over time, as consulting became more of a strategic industry and a more mature sector, they have entered into the MBA classes and now have become a very strong representation for many of the incoming and post and graduating classes. So, as I mentioned, the big three, McKinsey, BCG, and Bain, are all similar in a lot of ways, right? They all work on typically big consulting engagements. They work for well-known brands. They have international offices, but there are nuances between them. So, starting off with McKinsey is actually sort of the pioneer, if you will, of management consulting, right? They were founded in 1926, so they're the oldest of the big three. And even though they do everything, they tend to have a little bit of a focus on technology and education, though, because they have such a broad range of talent and sectors, and they're always looking to grow. That doesn't mean that that's all they do, right? You can pretty much find a case at McKinsey for any industry or function. I think even once, or maybe it was a few years ago, they had worked on a case for the Vatican, right, for the Pope. So there's a lot that can be done there. They employ about 26,000 people across the world in 120 offices. So this is really great, and this is pretty much the case for all of these three firms. But if you are coming from a local office and you don't necessarily want to work in a big city, that option is presented to you, right? So they are always constantly expanding, and this allows McKinsey, Bain, and BCG to kind of tap into the wealth of their international network. And specifically for McKinsey, it's a global staffing model for the most part, which means that a team, let's just say it's a managing partner, engagement manager, a consultant, a business analyst, and so forth, will be actually staffed across different offices. Now, it may be possible if one office has a specialty in a particular sector, they'll staff people from those offices, but generally speaking, the staffing model pulls from a large pool, which means that you might have a lot of travel because you are going to a client site and everyone's coming from a different place. So in order to be in the same particular location, it necessarily involves travel. So just keep that in mind. BCG is another great firm. They were founded in 1963, so they obviously came after McKinsey. They tend to focus a lot on corporate development, business growth, and innovation. Again, not solely what they do, but this tends to be sort of a lot of their peak or spikes. They're slightly smaller than McKinsey, so they're as of now just shy of 20,000 people across across 85 offices. But again, huge stretch. And I don't think for the most part you'll have a hard time finding a geographic location that fits your needs. They have, we'll get to Bain in a second, but BCG kind of has a little bit of a hybrid model where they try and do a lot of local staffing. So they'll try and bring people from the same office, but they still do pull from a broader, more regional consultant pool. So there may be travel. We can get to this in the Q&A, but generally speaking, like if you want to prioritize around travel or no travel, you can do that. You just have to keep that in mind and recognize that some offices are stronger in certain. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt again, but which slides are you on currently?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on the structural differences. Is it not update? I'm sorry.
No, it's not updating at all. We still see the same slide. Big round table having executive sitting around it.
Oh, that is
That's
strange.
the same slide. Yeah.
Sorry, everyone. We're
Can you take the presentation in full screen mode? Yeah.
Is that better?
1 second. Yes. So what we see now, structural differences between the three. I can say. Okay. Can you try to move on? Just wanted to check if slides are advancing.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So, are we looking at the structural differences now?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So, good thing is I was reading off of a lot of the bullet points. so hopefully those who are on the stream are listening, but I'll give you obviously a second to catch up here. Basically, I'm just pointing out the differences between the three firms. And again, it was all sort of narrated anyways, but so BCG, as I mentioned, kind of has a hybrid model. So as you think about whether you want to travel, if there's an area that you want to particularly focus on, you can you can optimize for travel if that's a concern for you. So Bain and Company is the third, the most recent, the youngest of the big three. They tend to have a slight bent towards private equity, mergers and acquisitions, and retail. But again, their scope and scale is quite large. They are, significantly smaller than the other two. About half the size or less than half the size of McKinsey, with 11,000 people across 47 offices. So you do have a fair amount of breadth and scale, but keep in mind it is considered a generally smaller firm. But they tend to really focus a lot on local staffing, which tends to mean less travel, which can be appealing for a lot of people. But for those who do want to have more of an international global experience, McKinsey may be a better fit for you. So just keep that in mind. Okay. So these three firms and consulting in general tend to be a huge feeder into many of the world's top MBA programs. So if anyone listening here is thinking about pursuing business school, they will notice that many of their friends or colleagues or people they know of who work at these three firms tend to go into these firms, right? Into these top MBA programs. And I'll also note that it's also a very popular location or destination for people post-MBA. So these firms actually offer very structured internships, both at the undergraduate, but definitely at the MBA level, where you work for the firm for 10 or so weeks during the summer between your first and second year, with the idea that you get a chance to understand what it's like to work at these firms on a trial basis, and similarly, they get to test you to understand if you would be the right fit and if you were capable of doing the work. And so the idea also is at the end of the summer internship, there's usually an offer granted if you met all of the requirements and generally got along with people, with a full-time offer that you can come back to after graduation. This is very appealing to a lot of people who like having that structure, who want that sort of certainty that if they do the internship well, they can have a job really at the end of their summer before their second year at business school. Also, it's very common for incoming MBA students who have worked at these firms to return to them. They generally like working at these places because there's a great camaraderie. The compensation is usually pretty favorable, and they generally have a good rapport with their people. They feel this is a great job. I've gotten 2 to 4 years out of it prior to my business school degree. I've learned a lot in business school, and now I feel like I'm ready to return and potentially rise up the ranks. And a lot of these people actually go under what's sort of a sponsorship agreement, which is very common in consulting and finance, less so outside. But the general idea is the firms will say, we really like you. We thought you did a great job. We'd like you to come back. In fact, we will pay for your MBA degree. And in turn, we want you to commit to a few years of post-MBA experience with us. So for many people, this sounds like a great deal because the MBA is expensive and you're foregoing income as it is, but at least this helps mitigate that cost. This is usually reserved for the consultants at the MBB consulting firms who are amongst the highest performers, but it is still fairly commonplace. So if that's of interest to you, it's definitely something worth exploring if you're at one of these firms. Now, one of the reasons why people like working at these firms is because they feel that they get a huge amount of responsibility very, very early in their careers, right? So a lot of people kind of consider it almost like management training on steroids, if you will, right? So the big three consulting firms work with, as I mentioned, some of the biggest names in corporate America, everyone from General Electric to JP Morgan to Dow Chemical and so forth. So as a young person, you'll get at working at one of these firms, be it at the undergraduate level or the MBA level, you'll get tremendous exposure to working with these blue chip type of companies, or in the case of the financial community, some of the top private equity firms, or in the case of nonprofits, some of the best foundations. And so this exposure to real life problems is very appealing, right? It's sort of eye awakening, if you will, for tons of folks. And like I said, many of the opportunities presented, you get to be part of a team where you get to decide or help at least influence the major decisions that these companies are facing. So maybe the question is, well, do we restructure an entire division of our company, potentially, or do we expand one? And you do the analysis that helps lead to that, or do you help a private equity firm decide whether to invest or pass, right, on an investment that they're facing? And so the ability to kind of see these real life problems very early on is quite appealing. It's something that people have a lot of pride in, and at least at the pre-MBA level, it gives you great exposure so that when you do come to the MBA program and you get to do case studies or learn about examples in class, you actually have some exposure to it that you can then impart with your fellow classmates. And a lot of these, I will also add one other point, that a lot of the big three also happen to trust a lot of their young employees with this kind of responsibility, because they know that in order to get into some of these firms, they go through fairly high rigorous interview processes. They have structured team processes to help drive high quality of the work. And so the combination of both the structure and the quality of the people really lends itself well to putting them in front of C-suite executives and the like. So another reason why a lot of people seek out jobs at McKinsey, Bain, and BCG is because they feel it's sort of actually, like I mentioned in the previous slide, in a way, is like an MBA on the job, right? They're getting this tremendous amount of experience, and they're getting to work in environments that are highly stimulating, intellectually challenging, and frankly intense in a good way. So these big three firms invest a ton of money into training their consultants, right? They realize they don't make anything in the form of a product They don't have a tangible asset that they sell. They sell their people, right? The intellectual property, the strength of the processes that they go through to solve problems, and the people who help deliver on those promises, right? So without them, they have nothing. So people is very, very important, and a lot of consultants feel that comes back in a very reciprocal way, right? They get good training, but they also deliver that good training to their clients. And I will say also in general, that comes in the form of many, like a series of structured activities that are really kind of help design to train early consultants, again, at the post-undergraduate level and the post-MBA level, to kind of get them understanding like how to think about consulting, how to think about corporate America, right? So they have classes, workshops, summits that teach them how to do everything from Excel modeling to structuring a presentation to developing a framework on a particular corporate problem. But it's also a great camaraderie, it's a way to build camaraderie. So it introduces them to a lot of their colleagues from other domestic offices or really international offices. A lot of people look forward to sort of the summits or the trainings or the retreats or whatever they call them, that happen every, say, 6 months to a year. It's a great opportunity to have some fun, to let loose, but also to learn a lot and get to network with your colleagues. And in general, I think the idea of this tremendous opportunity to learn, to develop cross-cultural management skills is just a real nice advantage for these big three consulting firms to recruit people coming out of college, but also a great opportunity to for people to have fun and learn a lot, and to then go on potentially in other jobs where they felt they had a very good experience and can speak highly of their firms. So I've touched upon this a little bit here and there, but a huge another reason why a lot of people like the big three consulting firms is that the network is tremendous, right? So that comes in two forms, right? The first one is that it comes with the network of people who you're working with now. So if you are working at one of these big consulting firms, you will have access to a tremendous amount of people who might have worked on a particular problem, say in product management, in the healthcare space, or you have access to a partner who worked on a market expansion for an aluminum company, right? The scale and the scope of the MBB network within the firms as you're working there is tremendous. So you'll always feel like you have this great access to information and to talent, right, the world over. But also the bonds you make with your individual teams are really, really powerful. So for a lot of these firms, at least pre-pandemic, you were traveling to the client site up to, say, 4 or 5 days a week for many months on end, potentially. And so naturally, you're going to develop a strong bond with your colleagues, right? You go out to dinners in the evening. You're working in like usually small rooms in an office. And so by default, you're going to end up kind of fostering a very collective and cohesive environment. And so a lot of times people often will stay in touch with folks that they worked on a case engagement because they had such a formidable experience with them. The other thing too, the second point I was mentioning is that let's just say you leave the firm, because look, a lot of people do consulting for a short amount of time. It's not always a career destination for people, but the actual like alumni network can be very, very powerful itself. So if you are looking to leave McKinsey, Bain, or BCG, one great source of recruiting is former alumni of these firms as well. So you might say, hey, I worked at BCG, or I'm at BCG now. I want to go into corporate strategy at Nike. Who at BCG previously worked there? And so it's like having an MBA program or a college on your resume. Having MBB on your resume is another way to find a commonality to kind of help you get it in. And look, the MBB consultants themselves also like hiring alumni of their firm, right? Of their former firms. They have a certain perhaps loyalty, but they also know what the experience is like. And so having that relatability as well as a respect for the quality of work, it can be a huge asset for someone looking at exit opportunities. And overall, and again, in general, you just get the sense from working at some of these places that they're just made up of well-connected, smart, successful, driven people, and a lot of highly intelligent and ambitious people want to be in those sorts of environments, certainly coming out of school. So as I mentioned, exit opportunities are a huge asset for or a huge appeal for a lot of people looking to work at McKinsey, Bain, or BCG. There is something that's called, and every firm has a slightly different name for it, but sort of the upper out policy, which basically means, look, we expect you to be progressing at this firm over time. And if that isn't in the cards, like, we will not necessarily show you the door, but we will encourage you to kind of seek employment elsewhere over time. And a lot of times they're very supportive. They just realize that, consulting, again, is not for everyone, that there are certain people who are destined to be partners or managing directors and other people who are not, or, destined to do other things. And that's totally fine. In fact, kind of going back to my previous point, the network is what really helps people who have done their time at one of these firms and now is ready to move on. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of these former, or the big three firm actually appreciate helping their soon-to-be former consultants place jobs, because they actually view it as a great way to get business in return. So if you worked at, say, Bain and Company, and you went to work at KKR, let's say, for example, and KKR is deciding which consultancy to hire for a particular project, and say you have influence on it, or the team that they're thinking about hiring at Bain and Company, that would be a tremendous you might be inclined to go with Bain, right, because of that relationship, that experience. So they view it very much as sort of a symbiotic or reciprocal relationship. And as I mentioned sort of earlier, there are a wealth of opportunities that open up to you as a soon-to-be post-MBB consultant. So a lot of people, especially at the undergraduate level, might look to go into private equity. They may want to start a company or join an early-stage startup. Major nonprofits are oftentimes a huge feeder. Or maybe you look at sort of a strategic or operational role at a big name company or a mid-sized company, right? There are a wealth of opportunities available to you because people respect the reputation of these firms and understand the rigor that goes into holding one of these jobs, even if it's only for a short, say, 2-year period. Now, with any sort of great opportunity, there are always going to be downsides, right? And nothing is truly perfect. And so should come as no surprise that work-life balance at one of these firms can be difficult. The projects themselves are very demanding. I mean, this is why clients pay top dollar. They expect you to find out the answers, or at least guide them to the answers of some of the most complex problems that they themselves didn't have the resources, the time, or the knowledge of how to solve. And with that comes a lot of long hours, right? These projects can last long times, anywhere from 60 to 100-hour weeks. I just want to be honest with you, these projects can be intense. They work around the clock, and it's not uncommon to see weekend work too. It depends obviously on your case team and the engagement of the firm, but these are intense jobs, right? There's difficulties getting them, and so when you do get through the gateway, they expect you to work hard for them. Also, as I mentioned, travel is a huge component. Now, of course, it depends on the specific consulting firm, but think about in the most extreme cases where you're traveling anywhere from 45 to 50 weeks a year. That means being away from home during the week, maybe being away from significant others. If you're older, being away from children, and that can be very taxing. Plus, as you kind of rise up in the ranks, you tend to travel to multiple client sites within a given week. So I've heard of situations where partners will jump on like 5 flights across 5 days. So that's not out of the realm of possibility. So that some people like it, some people get into a rhythm, other people find that to be very taxing. And sort of on a similar note, you don't necessarily have a lot of control over your weekly schedule. You may not be, especially as a young recruit, able to decide whether you want to travel or not. So you're almost beholden to either the client or the case team or both. And so that can be a little bit disruptive to folks. Just not having sort of a home base for more than, or a place to stay, or a home that you spend more than 3 days a week can be really challenging, and sort of an adjustment for a lot of people who are used to sort of the more regular schedule of being at home in one location. The other downside, if you will, although people would argue it's a strength depending on which side of the coin you're coming from, is that MBB consultants, are clearly very smart, organized, ambitious people, but they're also very, high quality type A personalities. And so that naturally butts heads. You can have intense work environments, personalities will clash. And so that's just kind of the nature of being in an environment with so many people who are driven and so used to doing things their way. So working for a good manager, someone who respects boundaries, someone who understands how to manage a team can be not always as common as you would think it is. And as I mentioned, the up or out culture is I think a constant source of pressure for consultants. They feel that they're, as hard as they're working, they're consistently being put under pressure to improve. And so depending on sort of what your career ambitions are, I think that can be a little bit challenging compared to, say, maybe a different type of role where you can stay in that one position or title for a long period of time without having to worry about losing your job or being shown the door. So just keep that in mind. Now, while McKinsey, Bain, and BCG are fantastic places to work for many of the reasons I've discussed, those are not the only management consulting firms that exist out there, right? This is a large and diverse sector. And so if you say go for one of these roles and you don't get it, that's perfectly fine, right? There are a lot of other comparable opportunities. Or let's just say that you decide McKinsey, Bain, and BCG are not the right fit for some of the reasons I discussed. There's a wealth of opportunities elsewhere. So there are other large international consulting firms, right? Deloitte is fairly big. EY Parthenon has grown over the years. Strategy and KPMG, these are firms that do very similar type of work, but maybe have come from a different origination, although EY Parthenon, for example, was a spin out from Bain. And so you can still get this high quality experience other places. So if you are serious about becoming a consultant, I strongly urge you not just to look at these three firms, but also look at the broader landscape. Now, let's just say you want a smaller experience, also boutique consulting firms that are excellent as well. LEK, for example, does a lot of strategy and private equity work. And there are others that are maybe more regionally based where, you again can get a great experience working with high quality people, but perhaps want to be in a smaller or more intimate place. There are also specialized consulting firms that do very specific stuff. So whether that's Mercer, that does a lot of HR consulting, or Nero, which does economic consulting, like you should think about if that's in a particular area that's of interest to you, you might be better off going to one of these firms where you can specialize in an area of interest, as opposed to going to the big three where, yes, you might be able to find a project of a similar nature, but may not be able to get quite the same repetition of something very specific in terms of case flow. And then finally, and this can also be an exit opportunity as well for folks coming out of consulting, but there are in-house consulting teams, business divisions or units at large corporations where they basically say, look, rather than outsource this type of work, which is oftentimes expensive, we can build our own team in-house, right, and do similar type of work. And the difference being is that you're pretty much just working on the problems facing that company, as opposed to moving from company to company or industry to industry. But you tend to develop really good relationships with the people in this company, and that might afford you the ability also to move around the company if, say, you're interested in doing something slightly different. So the point of this slide, again, is that there are a lot of opportunities, and I strongly urge people to think about the full landscape and not fixate nearly as much, even though these firms are really, really great. Now, one other point, and this is kind of a little bit more geared towards Admission Auto and what we do, is let's just say, even though the big three tend to place their consultants in the top MBA programs, there are other ways to compete if you're not, an MBB candidate, or as a lot of people compare them to, like higher level finance, private equity, or investment bankers, right? It's completely fine. You will still do well in the process, right? You still obviously have to have, good grades, a good GMAT or GRE score, strong references, and everything else. But when it comes to your specific work representation, I think it's important to kind of draw distinctions in two ways, right? The first is to say, look, McKinsey, Bain, and BCG, or other consulting firms are rewarded for the depth and the scale and of their work. But maybe perhaps you've had an even deeper experience, right? Let's just say you are someone who works in financial planning and analysis at a particular manufacturing company. Maybe you've gone deeper into the problems than the McKinsey consultant who came and worked with you for 3 months, right? I strongly recommend you think about what it is on a functional basis that you've done that really separates you from the pack, right? Did you get? Are you working on a problem for 3 years that again a Bain consultant is spending 3 weeks on, right? There are differences, and the admissions committees at these MBA firms will absolutely recognize the depth of those differences. So, don't feel that just because you're not having the same experience as an MBB candidate does not mean that you will not ultimately find strengths or bring competencies to your MBA class. And on a similar note, I would argue the same thing goes with industry diversity and knowledge. So, it's very rare that a big three consultant, especially on the pre-MBA level, is going to have deep sector expertise. Maybe they raise their hand and say, listen, I want to work on education projects, or I want to work on technology projects or something of that nature. That's fine, right? But generally speaking, most people like working at these firms because they want to see a variety of project work. Well, if you're coming from industry, however you want to define that, you might be better off doubling down on your home sector. So let's just say you work at Pepsi, right? You want to say, hey, listen, I'm going to be the Pepsi guy, or the food and beverage guy, or whoever it is, right? And that can be your source of differentiation compared to having, if you were an MBB candidate, having to compare yourself to the other consultants who have seen the same variety of work. It's harder to differentiate yourself because you're not going into one subject as deeply. So just keep that in mind. We have plenty of strategies for people. Look, we work with people who are not consultants all the time. It's a huge part of our business, and we oftentimes urge them to think in terms of this framework to be able to help create a little bit of differentiation between themselves and these top level consultants. So that's basically it in terms of the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to some questions. I know that we kind of held off for the time being, but I'm going to open up to the audience for anyone who has questions. Okay, great. So we have a question. I'm just going to read them out loud in case people are tuning in and can't see the screen. But it says here, I am a trial attorney that wants to pivot to business consulting. What do you think the odds are of changing from private law to MBB? Okay, so what I actually didn't mention, which this brings up a good point, is that when you are recruiting for these firms, let's just talk specifically at the MBA level, there really isn't a prerequisite for in terms of any type of job experience, right? There are two major entry points that exist in the consulting firms, and you can kind of guess it right now, right? One is at the undergraduate level, and the other is at the MBA level, or master's or PhD level, or even law school in some cases, right? After that, it becomes a little bit more difficult because you effectively have to lateral in, and so if that's to be the case, you usually need to have some sort of specific industry knowledge, and the idea is you're being funneled into a very, very specific type of practice as opposed to coming in at the more generalist level based on what I've mentioned before. Now, specifically in terms of your question about a trial attorney, it would be challenging if you did not do the MBA. I think that, again, you would have to have a very specific reason for wanting to go to one of these consulting firms, whether it's MBB or elsewhere, because you'd have to probably have a focus on legal, unless you spent a lot of time working in a particular industry within law. Otherwise, they are going to tend to pull from people who are coming from one of these graduate programs. So I would say that if you are looking about making the transition, think about the business school degree or another master's degree, and then go from there. That would be much, much higher. Otherwise, I think your odds are very low. So there's a question that, isn't the exposure provided to young ones and other companies like ZS Associates at par with the MBBs? Yes, I would argue it is. I think that slide that I showed basically speaks exactly to that, right? We designed this presentation because we tend to get a huge amount of interest in McKinsey, Bain, and BCG because of their long-standing relationships and international reputations. But absolutely, many of these consulting firms do have very, very high quality experiences. Look, and employers who are looking to employ or to take on former consultants, whether that be at ZS Associates or elsewhere, will absolutely look at the experience as very valid. It comes down to, I think, in a lot of cases, the network where, say a consultant is looking, or a former consultant is looking to hire a current consultant. It might be that there's a slight preference for someone coming from one of these big firms just because of that loyalty and familiarity. But you're absolutely right. Many of these other consulting firms are equally high quality. They do the same type of project work. They may not have quite the scale and scope of work in some cases, so they tend to be more focused, or they work on smaller gigs. But generally speaking, the experiences are all very, very similar, especially at a very young age. Okay, so another question reads here: I know the MBBs and other large consultancies ask for GMAT scores from MBA level candidates. Do you know if GRE can be accepted? I am pretty sure that they will accept the GRE. I think the idea of only accepting GMAT scores is more of a legacy idea, where it goes back many years, where the GMAT was the only exam that business schools accepted. Now that they're accepting the GRE, I am perfectly sure it's fine. In fact, a lot of times when you fill out applications for these firms, they'll also actually ask you, even at the MBA level, for your SAT or any other sort of standardized test that you've taken. So you will definitely not be disqualified if you only took the GRE and want to submit that. Another question reads: are mature candidates with over 10 years of previous work experience in a different industry, but a fresh are mature candidates with 10 years of work experience in a different industry, but a fresh MBA degree preferred by, MBB and other consulting firms? No. Everyone, especially at these big firms, everyone coming out of or currently in their business school program is going to almost surely go in at the same level. This can be a source of frustration, actually, for people who do have more years of experience and feel that they could probably slot in a higher role. Unfortunately, the way they've structured it is you have certain entry points. So I'm drawing a slight blank on some of the titles, but I believe like at BCG, you might come in at like the associate level, or at McKinsey, it might be associate level or something like that. It doesn't matter if you have 2 years of experience or you have 10 years of experience. If you're applying as an MBA graduate or soon to be MBA graduate, you have to come in at that same level. Now that may, your years of experience may actually work in your favor down the road, in that you might be able to get a rapid promotion faster because you have a wealth of business knowledge that can help separate you from other people in your class, but you are not going to be granted an exception at that level. If the exception to that is if you're applying as a lateral candidate, then you might come in at a higher level. But again, it's tricky, and there's a strong preference for a lot of these firms to promote from the same starting point. And so if you're a very experienced candidate, unless you're coming in at sort of a partner or very senior level, odds are you probably have to kind of start from the base position and then you work your way up. This question reads: I am from a non-target school for MBB. What should be the strategy to get selected for an interview at the MBB? So you need to network. You are right in the sense that target schools, it's much easier for candidates at target schools. The big consulting firms bring huge recruiting teams, usually made up of alumni of those schools, who then come in and say, look, we have X number of spots to fill, and we can take X number of, or Y number of people from this program. If you're not coming from a non-target school, it is going to be more challenging. There are typically not nearly as many seats reserved. There's a slight quota, if you will, that's different. So what I would say is really, really network hard, right? It's very easy to figure out who works at these firms, and maybe who might have a connection or be an alumnus of your non-target school. That's fine. Make sure you get in touch with them. You should also contact like sort of the team captains or the recruiting managers, or whoever manages sort of the overall process, usually someone in HR, because they can kind of point you in the right direction and make sure that you're at least going in line for the appropriate process for someone coming from your school. But look, it is an open process. They will not discriminate you because you're coming from a non-target school. The threshold just may be a little bit higher because there are going to be fewer spots. So just keep that in mind. Are there any other questions? We have a few minutes. If not, what I will just give my pitch right now is, again, if you are looking to go to a business school or you're looking to go to another graduate school, please contact us at Admission Auto. We have, a wealth of people who have worked at these firms who can give you a sense for again, what it's like to work there, and what it takes to get into these programs, with the idea that eventually you may want to pursue employment at one of these firms. They're great places to work. There are a lot of great places to work, and at Admissionato, we're always happy to help you think that through. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everyone. And we have a question. Any thoughts on interviewing for an office not in your school's country or locale? Yeah, that's totally fine. I'm not sure what you mean by locale specifically. Like if you're saying if you're say go to school in Boston and you want to interview in California, it doesn't really matter, especially domestically. I think if you're looking at a different country, you do need to put in a little bit more legwork to figure out whether the processes are aligned. Now, I have seen differences where people say who go to business school in London want to work in the US. They just have to make sure that they're not missing deadlines. So I would say either check online to see what the recruiting calendars look like, and if those are not readily available, again, get in touch with sort of the talent manager, the HR team captain, or whoever the appropriate contact person is early on, and then tell them this is your interest, and they can probably clue you into the process. Just get the information first, and then you can kind of work on it. But no, as far as interviewing for other locations, there's no problem with it at all. It's very common, especially when it comes to matters of like visas or employment situations. Oh, we have more questions. Great. What is a specific domain knowledge that MBB looks for in a candidate? None. That's why they're recruiting for out of these schools, right? Whether it's at the undergraduate or the business school level, they're assuming you basically don't have much knowledge, especially at the college level. And so they're saying, and from my point in the presentation, is they're going to train you, right? You just have to come in with raw intellectual power, an interest to learn, good soft skills in terms of being a good communicator, building great presentations, but everything else in terms of the hard skills and the industry knowledge you're going to learn. These consulting firms are great in the sense that you soak up a huge amount of information by virtue of the training programs, but also just the exposure you get to the real life problems, right, that you're faced. And so they're not expecting to have any new information. Now, in terms of the MBA programs, again, you do not have to have done consulting before. In fact, sometimes that can work against you if they feel that maybe you're trained in a particular way based on a certain consulting firm, and then they have to untrain you effectively, although obviously there's a lot of overlap. But they will, in the interview process, just want to understand your pre-MBA background, right? That's, I think, a fair part of any interview. And so they want to understand, like, well, what did you do at said company? What were your responsibilities? And then they will identify if you, again, have the raw skill and experience to be able to become an effective consultant. The one exception to this, again, is people who are applying sort of at the lateral level. You probably do need to have a domain knowledge because you'll be likely hired into a specific practice or function or both. And they're not really going to be able to train you in the same way that they do fresh graduates. Great. We have another question, which is, what are the target schools for MBB positions in Europe? So I admittedly am not 100% familiar. We do have people who focused on the European programs here, but generally speaking, you can expect schools like INSEAD, LBS, HEC Paris, and the like are going to be top feeders into McKinsey, Bain, and BCG. Again, that doesn't mean those are the only places that are only schools that place people into those big three consulting firms. But like in the US, the dynamics are very similar in that, they're going for the top students, right, from the top programs. And so you can imagine that it will follow very similar to the rankings. Even if a program is, say, known to be a little bit more focused on, say, finance, which tends to be sort of like the big other feeder that's discussed along consulting, that doesn't mean that they don't look for consultants. They may not have nearly a strong representation, but they're almost surely, if you just look at the alumni and the makeup of these graduating classes, they're always going to be alumni from the big three at all the top business school programs internationally, specifically in Europe. Hey, we have another question, which is, what is the best way to prep for consulting roles if you want to transition without an MBA, say with a finance or equity research background? Okay, great point. So one thing I actually didn't talk about a lot because the focus was a little bit more on sort of the nature of these consulting consulting firms and what separates them from others and just general jobs is actually the process of interviewing itself. I've alluded to the fact that it's rigorous, but what is important to know is that the interviews they're typically in two different forms. They are behavioral in the sense that they obviously want to get to know you, and you have to think about questions like brain teasers, like your times you've demonstrated leadership, other times you've worked in a team, your weaknesses, kind of the same types of questions you would expect actually to go into an MBA program or another type of job perhaps. But the big differentiator and what kind of is special about consulting firms is that they're very big on what's called the case interview. And what they mean by that is it's sort of like a business problem that they throw at you. And each firm has a slightly different twist on how they go about doing it. But the general idea is they will give you some facts and a general prompt to start things off. And then you sort of build a framework. You work with the interviewer in an iterative fashion where you continue to solve the problem. They give you feedback or more information depending on if you unlock it or not. And then you keep going on and on, eventually doing some sort of math or problem solving on the spot, and then eventually coming to a conclusion. That's kind of, again, a unique experience that is common to the consulting firm. So you have to keep that in mind. So I would say, with respect to your question, if you want to prep for consulting roles, you absolutely need to understand like how to do these consulting interviews. They're very different in terms of their cadence. So I would pick up, there are several books. I think The Vault is a big one. There are a couple that I can't think of off the top of my head, but they're very common. And so I would absolutely study that, read through those books, study them, do practice cases with former or current consultants. Many of them are trained to do this. So that's always a good way to kind of understand the rapport and network, right? Because a finance or equity research background is not going to be a natural feeder into these firms. And so you kind of have to decide whether you're going to get the MBA program. And if you're not, you're just going to kind of come from industry, what specifically you're going to be able to pitch to these firms and what practice specifically you want to go to. For example, McKinsey might be a good fit for someone such as yourself because they have a corporate finance practice, right? It's very well known. It's not huge, but I'm sure that they would appreciate someone with an equity research background. So if I were you, I would not only prep for these interviews, but identify people in this practice and start talking to them and seeing, if there's an opening and whether you would be a good fit. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left if anyone has any questions. Okay. We have another question, which is, what are the characteristics, qualities, and skills of the consultants who thrive and stand out in MBB roles? That's a great question, actually. So I think everyone's personality is a little bit different. And certainly managers at these consulting firms will look for slightly different things in what they consider to be their top candidates, right, or top consultants. And usually when you have a top consultant and you're a manager and you have people you like working for, you'll request them on projects again and again because, you just enjoy working with them and you feel that you're productive and so forth, right? Just makes for a good team environment. So I can't say that there's like a very specific list, but I will broadly speculate or comment on the fact that I think that, being technically proficient is extremely important. So, you have to be accurate in your work. A lot of times the slides and the data or the analysis that you're doing goes directly to the client, even if it is scrubbed with other members of your team. And so you don't want to have that be error prone. You want to be clear and accurate. So that's certainly very important. You also want to be a good communicator. So a huge part of the consulting value add is not just the intellectual property that we talked about, but the relationships that consultants share with their clients. And so even at a junior level, you might be paired up with, say, an appropriate or a similar type of person at the client themselves. And so they're going to say, hey, X, you work with Y at the company and really work on the details with them, get the data, scrub through this analysis with them and so forth. So you have to be a good communicator, someone who can present good work, someone who is respectful, someone who is responsive and so forth. And then I guess I would also add is, another big quality is, again, just being what they a lot of these consultants call sort of the airplane test. I think it's is the name. But basically the idea is like, if you can you be an enjoyable person, right? Are you someone that people wouldn't mind spending hours upon their day, usually away from their family, with you, right? So the idea of the airplane test, or the moniker for it, is that you, if you were stuck on an airplane with someone for 6 hours, or stuck at an airport for several large periods of time, is this the type of person that you would want to engage with? Can you find things to talk about besides work and sort of just be a generally good colleague? And if the answer is yes, then that certainly makes you much more of an attractive quality or candidate for these firms. Great. Another question here. Are applicants who get referred by current or former consultants of any firm really at competitive advantage compared to regular applicants? Yes and no. So not so much former consultants, because there are enough staff on hand, or current staff, that they usually just get people who are current. But actually, that's not true. Sorry, because at the business schools, former consultants are a lot of times good touch points into their current classmates. So sorry for that. But I would say that the answer yes is that referrals are very helpful, because a lot of people apply for these firms, right? Especially at business school programs, as I mentioned, they're popular feeders. So there are only so many interview slots. So it's important to kind of find a way to get your resume flagged, and one way to do that is through referrals. So that definitely helps you. But a lot of times that takes is just getting to know 2 or 3 people, so that you are considered like a top candidate, right? But then the answer to the question is also no, because once you get into the interview stage, it does not matter how you got in there. You still have to perform on the case interview. If you cannot do the case, or do the case better than your competition, then it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you were referred in or how you got in. They're going to assume that you cannot do the work, or frankly, they'll just pick someone who they think could perform on the spot. Now, I will say, by the way, that just because you don't do well in a particular case does not necessarily mean you would be a bad consultant, right? These cases are a little bit tricky in the sense that sometimes they just may not hit you. They're not always putting out all the information. You may be thinking in one direction, but the case is actually suggesting you go in another. And that's just life, right? That's the interview process. That's why I strongly urge you to look at, not just the big 3 consulting firms, but other firms as well. And also the other thing too is, again, the stars need to align for these cases, right? A lot of times there's very little room for error. If you perhaps went down in a slightly different path or reached a slightly different conclusion, that may not disqualify you, but the odds that someone else did get it perfectly, whether that be by hard work or luck, may just be the difference between you and them, right? All of these candidates who apply and at least get interviews are usually high quality, right? There, as the presentation discusses, there are many levels of filters that get applied to getting to that point, right? You have to have done well in school. You have to have had a good extracurriculars. You have had to have interviewed well. And so by the time you get to this interview stage, especially the final rounds, you're competing against the best of the best. So even if you are more than capable of doing this job, that margin for error is very, very tight. Okay, great. Well, I think we're all set. We're at the top of the hour. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. Hope you all found it to be an insightful and productive session. And again, please reach out to us at Admissionato if you are looking to apply to school. In any form, we're happy to help. We have free consultations that can be a great way for us to get to know you, and you to get to know us. And I wish you all the best of luck. So have a good one and stay healthy.